Suddenly, after a good supper, by Martin Waddell. Denis was at rest in the midst of a crowd of his relations, but he was not aware of their presence, for it was dark inside the vault, and darker still inside his coffin. He was alive, and the rest of them were dead. Their location was all they had in common. It was a horrible predicament, but Denis had not yet regained consciousness sufficiently to realize it. If he dreamed in his by now light coma, it was of a sumptuous supper he had enjoyed in the old Lodge Inn east of Briding, and the long walk across the downs to Averhill which had followed, a walk through the best of autumn worlds. On this high note his life had apparently ended. He now lay in a damp, dark vault, with a particularly nauseous smell, which could only be blamed on the onset of the decay of his granny, whom he had buried the week previously. Denis had passed away quietly in his sleep. His face bore no trace of the licentious life he had lived, but had obligingly composed itself in an expression of pious innocence, which wronged the man as much as it delighted his aunt, the last of the line. It is not amusing, in the light of what subsequently happened to Denis, to learn that his father and grandfather had passed away in exactly the same fashion, suddenly, after a good supper. His brother William, mercifully, had died on active service, mourned only by the man who had to scrape him off the wall over which he had been somewhat stickily distributed. William, it would seem, had been the lucky one. No one but his aunt was at all concerned at his passing, and she was really rather pleased. Granny, grandson, and aunt had lived a long time in Averhill in a state of mutual resentment. To follow Granny and grandson to the grave had more than delighted the maiden lady, though charitably we must assume that even she did not imagine for a moment that, as they laid him in the tomb of his ancestors, Denis was lightly breathing, all unseen in his coffin. In the nature of the family's malaise, it took the subject the best part of 4 days to regain consciousness, and this interval in itself had so far been sufficient to ensure that no one was around to answer their frantic knocking when it came. With Denis, all this was to change. If he had been kind and considerate to his elderly relatives, he would have gone the way of the rest of the family. Bad enough. As it was, he got what he deserved. On the morning of the 4th day, the day after his interment in the vault beneath Averhill Church, Denis at last opened his eyes in a white satin world. It was a narrow world, tremendously uncomfortable, for his arms were pinned across his chest by carefully concealed stitches that held them to his jacket. Some hours later, he finally found the strength to attempt a movement, but he was held tight. This, in a way, was his own fault, for he had, quite by chance, ended up in the coffin of the aunt who had now outlived him. On his sudden death, she had felt it incumbent upon her to let him have it, his need being more pressing. Denis, in a spiteful mood one day, had made up a box each for aunt and granny, a gesture which had become a matter for severe acrimony between the trio, for the two ladies took it as an indication that he wished to get rid of them, as indeed he did. The remaining aunt was only too happy to see her unpleasant nephew installed in the coffin he had specially made for her, and if it proved a trifle too small for him, that was just too bad. She had put him in very quickly, being a methodical old lady, managing to bend his legs a little before rigor mortis set in, or what passed for rigor mortis in the eyes of the medical men. From Denis's point of view it was an unfortunate assumption. Had his knees not been thus inexpertly bent by his aunt, the coffin might have closed quite comfortably over him, but as it was, the lid did not quite seal out the air. Damp, musty, dead air, with something of the odour of his dead granny's decay in it. Air seeped through the gap between the imperfectly fitted lid and the box, and kept him from smothering, which may have been the fate of his father and grandfather. At least it is charitable to hope so. He tried to press up the satin-lined lid that held him down. He tried and tried again with what strength he could muster. He battered upon it, he shouted, but there was only his dead granny to hear. At least she was the only person around with eardrum left unrotted. The rest were quite past that stage, poor dears. Not that his grandmother's unrotted ears were much use to her or him, though they were later to prove quite a delicacy. It was of no avail. He passed rapidly from fear to desperation, and from desperation to exhaustion. When he once more awoke, he was no better off. The satin still pressed down upon his cheek, his rouged cheek, for his aunt had done her best by him. He lay perfectly still in the silence of the coffin, all too conscious that what little strength he had was fast dwindling, that a gnawing hunger lurked outside his fear, a hunger matched only by his intense thirst. He had to get out of his aunt's coffin. Denis was not without resource. He knew certain of the secrets of his aunt's coffin, one of which was that, although it seemed to be made of the very best wood, it was not. The coffin-making had been an unpleasant gesture typical of the man, but he had never seriously intended to bury either of the two ladies in style. He had paid for a good-class varnish, but not for good wood. The coffin was, as coffins go, a frail affair. He thought over this aspect of his dilemma calmly, or at least as calmly as he could be expected to, considering the cruel circumstances in which he found himself. He knew the vault quite well, having inspected it prior to the occasion of his granny's funeral. It was of an oblong shape, with coffins laid in orderly ranks upon the racks, 3 to a space on each rack. He knew just where his own coffin must be situated, on top of that of his great-uncle Mortimer, some 80 years dead, and he realized that if he could but cause great-uncle Mortimer's crumbling coffin to give way beneath the weight which had been placed upon it, the two coffins might together fall to the stone floor of the vault, with every chance that the one which contained him would burst open. To achieve this not inconsiderable feat, it was necessary for him to attempt to jog his coffin from within, and this proved extraordinarily difficult. Had his coffin not been so light and ill-made, it is doubtful if he could have brought it off, but bring it off he did. The coffin rocked on top of long dead Mortimer's. Mortimer, who had, distressingly, passed away in his sleep, suddenly, after a good supper, and the old rotting box gradually began to give way. At last Denis felt his own coffin tilt a little, and redoubled his efforts. There came a soft, crunching sound, which was the impact of his coffin shell on Mortimer's exposed thigh bone. A jolt, and yet another jolt, and Denis's coffin began to slip. Then he was falling, and the next moment the coffin jarred on the stone floor of the vault, and he lost consciousness. He awoke with something grey and dusty on his chest, something held within a crumbling veil of shroud, something mummy-like, a wizened brown face set against his cheek in a desperate grin, crumbled lips and bared gums, eyes like yellowed peas in their socket pods. The falling coffins had jumbled them together, limb for limb, Denis and what was left of Mortimer. No matter, he was out. The door of the vault allowed a thin chink of light by its hinges, and in it he could see the coffins set in order around him. Here and there the gleam of a white bone through crumbled wood, a cobweb, which was a withering cloth or skin. He put the dusty, disintegrating thing, which was Mortimer, against the side of his broken coffin, cleared as much as he could of the corpse dust from his hair and eyes, and consoled himself with the thought that the worst was over. He had only to get out of the vault. This task he faced with confidence not unfounded. The strange malaise of the family, which he had now only come to understand, that which had sent a seeming death to one member after another suddenly after a good supper, this strange, swift sickness had been anticipated by at least one ancestor who had been mocked for his pains. Thankfully, Denis now turned his mind to finding the chain that led up through the earth to the death bell in the graveyard above, a bell reserved for the use of the living dead, who were normally sealed in their coffins and unable to get at it. It had been a cold and blustery afternoon in the world which Denis had left behind him. The wind had whirred and burred through the larches which overhung the graveyard wall. The rain had lashed monotonously down on the church roof. A slate or two had shattered on the paving stones below. Otherwise, all were well, but inside, out of the cold. By 5 o'clock, a storm had risen. A gale roared over the headland, and sea pounded the pier at the foot of the church lane. In the semi-darkness of his vault, down in the church foundations, poor Denis knew nothing of all of this. He was miserably groping around in the gloom, searching for the bell chain. He slithered over moist coffins, tangled his erring hands in the bodies of those long dead, embroiled his feet in random rib cages as coffin after coffin crumbled beneath his weight. His only course of comfort was the moisture on the walls. He sopped it up with the end of his shroud, which he then pressed to his mouth, so that at least he had a little to drink. It helped, but it did not ease the demand of his gnawing hunger. He forced himself to forget everything but the chain, and at length he found it. He had very little energy left, but he laced his fingers in the links and allowed himself to swing against it. In the world above, the bell tolled faintly, amid the clash of lightning and the rolling thunder, the distant hum of the sea and the swift pattering of the rain. Its note rang out over the deserted churchyard, but otherwise was lost in the bustle of the elements. People went to their beds undisturbed, without imagining for a moment that Denis was hanging from the end of the chain, his knees resting on a dead nephew. Later, it must have been much later, he wakened to find that his nephew's ribs had given way and the snapped bones had raked his thighs. There was no voice to cheer him, no sound from the outside. just the still of the corpses round him, the yellow white of exposed bones. The bell was no good. He had to try another way. He had to get out. The steel door of the vault could not be opened. No way out there. But if he could remove some of the brickwork around him, he needed an instrument to work with. The third coffin he opened provided him with what he was looking for, an unrotted thigh bone. He detached it from the skeleton of a dead relation and hacked vainly with it at the plaster joining the bricks. He made no impression. The effort almost finished him. The desperate craving for food finally overcame him now that the last hope had seemingly slipped away. At first he tried eating the damp edge of his shroud, but that was no good. He had to have food if he was going to live. He took one of Mortimer's few bones that had remained intact and tried to gnaw it, but Mortimer's bone crumbled in his hands. He tried eating moss from the damp floor, scraping it up with his fingernails, but there was not enough, not nearly enough. He no longer had the desire to do anything but find food to ease his craving. It was then, and only then, that he remembered his granny. The storm had settled when the bell began to ring again, and this time it was heard by several people, and with great annoyance. It was, after all, 2 o'clock in the morning, though Denis was not to know that, and would really not have cared if he had. The bell tolled loudly, fed with all the strength and vigour of the desperate man below, tolling for his life. Churchwarden, vicar, then policeman, one by one, they climbed the hill to the churchyard, saw the bell and the moving chain. It was, they supposed, something to do with the storm, an underground stream, said the policeman without much conviction. They really should go down to look. This idea appealed to no one. It was the middle of the night, and a graveyard, and the bell was, well, when all said and done, the property of the living dead. The vicar, a practical man, was for removing the clapper and going away, but the policeman had his duty and insisted. It was necessary, in the circumstances, to summon Denis's aunt from her bed, which she quitted with great reluctance, and, this done, they took torches and truncheons to the source of the trouble. It was a solemn procession, which found its way through the old oak doors and down the damp steps to the crypt. An unpleasant and ill-frequented place at the best of times, dead-end lodging for the local nobility. Down the flagstoned aisle they walked, at last coming to the great steel door. What followed was unpleasant for everyone but Denis. The door swung violently open after they unbolted it, and Denis staggered out, a wild figure in a ripped shroud, his nails torn with scraping for moss, his language, especially when he addressed his aunt, profane. In considerable confusion, they carried him away upstairs and laid him on the purple cushions of a pew, while the churchwarden was sent scurrying across the green for the local doctor. It was his aunt who first noticed the knob of bone that Denis gripped in his hand, thick flesh straggling from it, ripped sinew a-dangle against the tattered shroud. It was the gravedigger who had the unpleasant task of reassembling that which was left of the still fresh carcass in the vault below, replacing as best he could the bits that had been chewed. They kept it to themselves. Even the aunt agreed on that. Denis, who had never found his granny to be particularly to his taste, had now to admit to all and sundry that he owed the old lady a great deal, he would not have a word said against her. He had, after all, been miraculously restored to life, suddenly, after a good supper.